Welcome back. This is our fourth class and the last one that'll be recorded. The next class I'm looking forward to doing with you in person, on Zoom, but in person. And that will be more about modern poets, specifically Leonard Cohen and other Jewish North American poets on the Akedah. But the topic for today is going to revolve around these two men on the screen in front of you. On the left is Soren Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard, as the Danes would say, from about 200 years ago in Copenhagen. And on the right is Moses Maimonides, who was born in Spain, travels through North Africa on the land of Israel, and eventually lives and works his whole life in Egypt from more than 800 years ago. And we're going to talk about the contrast between the way that these two men, both philosophers, both profoundly pious and devout theological men from very different backgrounds and with very different value systems, approach the Akedah. We're going to start with Kierkegaard, and we'll use him as our starting point and something to, as a way of thinking through some of the philosophical and ethical issues. So Kierkegaard himself, just a bit of background. He's Copenhagen, as I said, first half of the 19th century, born to some money, so never actually had to work in his life. And so he had jobs here and there, but he wrote a huge amount. He wrote dozens of books, many of them short books, all in Danish. He spent a year in university in Germany, but he wrote in Danish. And that's significant for some of the intellectual history because although he was consuming what other people around Europe were writing, no one else was reading him. He's really a sort of local phenomenon during his lifetime. It's only later on, in the latter part of the 19th century and then into the early part of the 20th century, that Kierkegaard becomes a major figure in modern thought. Why is he attracted to the Akedah? Well, he is troubled by some certain aspects of religion in the modern world. So he lives at a time, and we live at a time where these effects are still felt, that a modern state is defined by citizenship, not by religiosity. One could be a citizen and yet not have to profess faith. It's not part of what it means to be a citizen of a modern country. He does have a sense that all people belong to some faith or another. At one point in one of his books, he writes that one of his characters says, that he's worried that he's not a true Christian, and that's a term I want to come back to in a moment. And the character's wife responds, well, what else would you possibly be? You're not a Mohammedan, and not a Muslim. And so what else could you be other than a Christian? And this is the sort of Christianity that terrifies Kierkegaard. For Kierkegaard, the whole point of life is to be a true something. For him, of course, a true Christian, but true something. How do we get to the essence of an identity that's not just a socially accepted set of actions? And he worries about authenticity to a great degree. So he worries about, for example, well, what am I outside of all my relationships? I am a spouse, I am a parent, I am a son, I am a brother, I am a teacher, I am a friend, I am a student, I am a this, and I can list all the different roles that I play in life. Kierkegaard's fine. Kierkegaard says that's fine. That's all very important. If you strip them all away, what's left? And one approach might be, no, there's nothing left. We are a bundle of these relationships. But if you say that to Kierkegaard, he would be horrified. How could it be that I am nothing other than what I mean to other people? There must be something to me in and of myself. And what am I outside of all these relationships? And that's I think, the core of much of his thought, is trying to figure out what does it mean to be something that's not just how I act in a certain circumstance or how I act vis-a-vis another person or vis-a-vis a set of expectations or an institution, but what am I? How do I be something? When he turns his eye towards religion, which he did very, very often, that means, what does it mean to be a person of faith, like actual faith? What does that mean? And so I should say that his book on the Akedah is called Fear and Trembling. And the book is a bit of an odd book structurally. So we're not going to try to interpret the entire book. It's not very long, and certainly everyone should go out and read it. It's quite enjoyable to read, especially in some of the newer translations. But it is an odd book. There are 4 prefaces and then another introduction, and then there's the heart of the book, which comes in 3 sections. And it's not entirely clear how these all come together, and we won't worry about such questions right now. But Kierkegaard says, like, what does it mean to be a person of faith? A true, what he calls a knight of faith. True knight of faith. So he says, either Abraham is a knight of faith, or Abraham is a murderer. That's sort of the crux of his issue. Either Abraham is doing something that's so transcendentally significant that it justifies anything, basically, or he's no better than any common murderer, because after all, he was willing to kill his child. And the narrator in the book, who's technically not Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard sort of makes up a narrator called John the Silent, and John, Kierkegaard's alter ego, says, I don't know what a knight of faith is. I don't know if I've ever met one. I know I'm not one, but have I met one? It's possible that every other person on the streets of Copenhagen is a knight of faith, but I have no way of knowing. Because, and this is really the key argument that Kierkegaard makes, because faith is something that is fundamentally non-communicable. It can't be explained in any way to someone who's not the person themselves, because it's just between the person, the knight of faith, and God. So if a person hears God calling them, then they know that God speaks to them. But if they want to tell someone else, there's no way to explain that in terms that are going to sound reasonable. And so Kierkegaard argues that this is Abraham's big problem. And he says, look, this is textually important, because if you read the story, Abraham is by himself on the mountaintop. Abraham, who up until now has been teaching and preaching and converting people to monotheism throughout his entire lifetime, for this journey goes all by himself. And even his attendants, his 2 attendants, he leaves at the bottom of the mountain, because this is something that he cannot communicate to anyone else. This is something that he knows he has to do. He understands it in the depths of his soul that this is what God wants from him, but there's no way to explain to anyone else that God wants it or what God wants. It's simply something that's not speakable. That's why he, according to Kierkegaard, he never mentions it to Sarah. Sarah's not involved because Abraham never tells Sarah, and that's because there's nothing to say. Either you're in or you're out, but there's no way to communicate this. And therefore, Kierkegaard says, there's no way for me to know if you or everyone else around me is a knight of faith. All I can ask is whether I am. Beyond that, there's nothing more to talk about. Fundamentally something that cannot be said. For Kierkegaard, this is a very central idea. It's a very important idea. It opens up the possibility of someone being true to themselves in a way that's shorn of all social networks. Right? So this has nothing to do with the way that anyone perceives me, and in fact, it cannot be put into terms of how anyone perceives me. Now, early in the book, Kierkegaard says that. Imagine that I heard a sermon from a pastor on a Sunday morning talking about the lofty faith of Abraham, who was willing even to sacrifice his own son for the call of God. And imagine that I then went home and said, I feel this also. And I took my son and I went into the streets with a knife and I said, I'm going to do this. And I start taking him through the streets of Copenhagen out to the mountains, and I'm gonna go find a place to sacrifice him. And the pastor found me on the streets, and the pastor said, where are you going? And I said, well, I was so inspired by your sermon that I'm going to sacrifice my child in the mountains. The pastor would, of course, stop me. Said, no, you misunderstood. That's not what I meant. You shouldn't do that. Absolutely not. And Kierkegaard thinks that the pastor actually is wrong there, or at least may likely be wrong. Can't really know, but he says that this pastor is not a true knight of faith. The pastor is saying things. He's trying to talk about faith, but he doesn't understand faith. If he understood faith, he would actually not be able to intervene there. All he would be able to say would be, I wonder if you're a knight of faith. I, an outsider, have no way of assessing your internal faith and relationship vis-a-vis God. Now, for Kierkegaard, the true test of this all, and the words he uses to describe this, are ethics, which means for Kierkegaard all of the relationships to other human beings, and faith. So ethics is the sort of normal thing. It doesn't matter whether I think it's ethical in the sense of like good or bad, but ethical for Kierkegaard means what I do vis-a-vis others because of those others. And for Kierkegaard, the Akedah was basically a test of whether faith could triumph over ethics. Triumph over is maybe not exactly the right term. I struggle to think about how to put this exactly. The term he uses is to suspend ethics, because Kierkegaard does believe in ethics. It's not that he doesn't think that we fundamentally have to worry about other people, take other people into consideration, be good people, give charity, worry about the poor, and so on and so forth. Of course, ethics is very, very important. Absolutely. Normally. The question is, though, is it possible that there comes a time that there's a clash between faith, which is personal, and ethics, which is by definition not personal? It's vis-a-vis, relative to other people. And if there is such a clash, can it be that faith suspends the ethical? That the call of faith, the necessity to act on faith, forces me to put ethics on hold temporarily. I'll come back to it. But right now it's suspended. Now, it's not just that faith suspends ethics, it's that faith suspends ethics for a greater purpose, for a greater good, for some higher calling. And that higher calling, or that purpose, he uses the Greek word telos, which meaning an end, a purpose. And so he coins the term the teleological suspension of the ethical. The teleological suspension of the ethical. That faith makes me suspend ethics for a purpose, for some greater good. Now, when I say greater good, I don't mean greater good in any rational sense, right? So don't ask me to explain what the greater good is. I can't tell you why this makes sense. And in an amazing passage, Kierkegaard says, Abraham could have told everyone about how much he loves Isaac. But what he really wanted to say was that he loves Isaac so profoundly that he's even willing to sacrifice him. And since that couldn't be said, because it's about faith, not about ethics, Abraham had to remain silent, which is why Abraham is alone on the mountaintop. And again, bring this whole full circle, Kierkegaard says, he has a chapter, the key chapter philosophically in this book is called, Is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? Is such a thing possible? Does that even make any sense? And his answer, not surprisingly, is yes. But he actually never says so. What he says is, look, I, not Kierkegaard, but I, John the Silent, the narrator of this book, I don't know if there's a teleological suspension of the ethical. All I know is the following. If there is no teleological suspension of the ethical, then Abraham is a murderer, damned to hell for his willingness to kill a child who is innocent of all sin. If there is a teleological suspension of the ethical, then that explains Abraham's actions. And so, although the book never says, therefore we know the conclusion, the point is very clear. The point is that if you take Abraham to be a good person, and I don't care whether you think he's a good father, like we talked about last time with the poem, Kalir's poem, but if you think he's fundamentally a good figure in the Bible, if you look at the Bible and you say, this is a book that I learned from, if you're a person of faith who takes the Bible as a positive book, and therefore Abraham as not a damned murderer, then you have to conclude that yes, there is such a thing as a teleological suspension of the ethical, and faith may sometimes dictate that we suspend ethics. Now, I'm not doing full justice to Kierkegaard's thought here. It's more developed, it's more subtle, it's more contradictory. There's all sorts of things that go on in the book. But that is the crux of his interpretation. If I had to summarize it, I would give you this passage from the middle of the book, that the conflict in the story is between the universal ethics, in other words, what makes sense on a universal basis. We all believe we need to take care of children. We need to take care of our own children. We need to protect innocent people. We need to not murder people. Fairly straightforward ethical norms. These are universal. And the call of God, which is inherently individual and private. And Abraham opted to depart the realm of the ethical, the realm of the universal, in which life is governed by laws, which can be articulated for the benefit of everyone, and enter the realm of the individual, in which man responds directly to the personal call of God. And now, quote, by his act, Abraham's act, he overstepped the ethical entirely and possessed a higher telos outside of it, in relation to which he suspended the former. So again, it's not that Kierkegaard doesn't believe in ethics. He just thinks that Abraham has left the realm of the ethical, and for the sake of this different realm, the realm of faith, which is by definition personal and private, cannot be communicated. Now, again, I want to urge you to read this. It's an amazing book. I think there are passages there that each time I read them, just make me sort of sit back and sort of blown away by the faith, by the piety of Kierkegaard, and by the sensitivity that he has to understand what it means to be a religious person. And religious, I don't mean observant in the sort of sociological sense, or even in the active sense. I mean religious in the depths of one's soul. He really gets it, although he professes not to. But what do we think of this as a reading of the Akedah? Well, here's where the problems start, right? So I mentioned these passages. So two last quotes that'll then sort of help us transition to the way this is reacted to by Jewish readers. So why did Abraham do it? For God's sake, and in complete identity with this, for his own sake. But why? Like, what does it mean? What's the purpose? It's teleological after all. And Kierkegaard can only say, rational explanations must end. There's nothing to say. I can't say anything about it. So although I just said it's an amazing book, it's a profound book, it's also a very frustrating book. Because of course, we're okay, I think, I would be okay with someone saying, look, normal ethics are as follows, but here's why this case is different. Right? Normally we don't do X, but now we do X because there's this greater good. Let me tell you about the greater good. But Kierkegaard says that greater good is by definition ineffable. It's like the name of God. It can't be articulated. And so the book doesn't articulate it. And that means that you just sort of have to take the book's word for it, that Abraham has something going on. The knight of faith is obliged to rely upon himself alone. He feels the pain of not being able to make himself intelligible to others, but he feels no vain desire to guide others. The true knight of faith is a witness, never a teacher, and therein lies his deep humanity. So again, this is such a remarkable thing to hear about Abraham in particular, Avraham Avinu, who according to the Midrash, but it seems to be maybe even implied in the text, that he spent decades teaching, preaching, bringing people into the fold, but not at this moment. At this moment, he is alone. Kierkegaard says he can be admired, but not learned from. He keeps silence, he cannot speak. And therein lies the distress and the anguish. So Kierkegaard wants us to feel bad for Abraham, not just because he's about to lose his child, which we all do, but actually even more profoundly for Kierkegaard is because he can't explain to us why he's about to lose his child. For if, when I speak, I am unable to make myself intelligible, then I am not speaking. Now, Abraham is able to say the most beautiful things any language can express about how he loves Isaac, but this is not what he has at heart to say. It's the profounder thought that he would sacrifice him because it is a trial. The latter thought no one can understand, and hence everyone can only misunderstand the former. So we can't even understand what love really means for Abraham. Remember, Abraham is the first person in the entire Bible to say to have loved someone. So ominous, right? We mentioned that we drew attention to this when we first saw the text. The first time that we have the root ahav in the Hebrew Bible is God talking to Abraham saying, take the child whom you love and sacrifice him. Like, wait, what does love mean? I don't understand. And Kierkegaard says, right, you can't understand. If you don't understand the sacrifice part, you can't understand the love part. Now, how did Jews react to Kierkegaard? So as I said, Jews actually, like most people, didn't react to Kierkegaard at all for a long time. It was really much later on, about half a century after his own passing in the late 1840s, around 1850, that people started to read him more intensively. And that's because it tapped into some of the later strands of thought, of philosophical thought, existentialism, but also some of the other. Heidegger really liked Kierkegaard. Of course, Heidegger is a Nazi, which may or may not be related. But they, once you get to around 1900, everyone philosophically oriented is reading him. And this is certainly significant for the people that you have on the screen in front of you, because people who had a philosophical education in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, all read and thought deeply about Kierkegaard. So how did Jews react to it? So let me give you a sampling. Milton Steinberg, great reform leader in the United States, probably most famous today as the author of As a Driven Leaf, the brilliant novel about the rabbis of the Mishnah, and particularly Elisha ben Avuya, the heretic rabbi. Steinberg was a communal leader, prolific writer, and he says in as sharp terms as possible, nor does anything in Judaism correspond to Kierkegaard's teleological suspension of the ethical. From the Jewish viewpoint, and this is one of its highest dignities, the ethical is never suspended, not under any circumstance and not for anyone, not even for God, especially not for God. For Steinberg, it's so obvious that God and ethics are on the same team. They speak in the same voice, or they speak different languages, but with the same message, that it makes no sense to talk about suspending ethics for faith. Ethics is what faith's all about. Marvin Fox, who is an Orthodox thinker in the 1970s, 80s, a little bit before as well. The rabbi's understanding of the Akedah differs from Kierkegaard's, and a properly Jewish theology must follow the rabbinic tradition and reject the views of Kierkegaard. And just two more quotes. Ronald Green, despite a handful of classical Jewish texts which partially share certain aspects of Kierkegaard's reading, there was generally an unbridgeable gulf between the two bodies of thought. And more recently, philosopher Zev Levi, what Kierkegaard extols and glorifies, Judaism condemns as sacrilege. So these are very, very strong repudiations of Kierkegaard's thought. There is a longer story to tell about how Kierkegaard was received in Jewish thought, because you have thinkers such as Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik and Professor Yeshayahu Leibovich, who absolutely see value in Kierkegaard's interpretation of the Akedah in different ways and to different degrees. But if we were primarily interested in the way this has been received among 20th century Jewish thinkers, those two figures would complicate this somewhat, because they did see Kierkegaard as not just valuable, but containing lessons that were worth propounding and maybe even reflecting the teachings of the Akedah. But I'm going to put those aside for now, because I think the people that we just mentioned, who argue that in fact Jewish thought was vastly different from the way Kierkegaard saw the Akedah, are fundamentally right. That there's nothing until the 19th century that goes in Kierkegaard's direction. And it's not that everyone who goes in Kierkegaard's direction was influenced by Kierkegaard, but that there's something about modern thought that maybe inspired an approach like this, the clash between sort of civil society and personal religion. Once you separate church and state, religion becomes a more personal matter rather than a communal matter. So there's a lot to unpack there that I won't try to do right now. But fundamentally, I think it's correct that Jewish thought did not have anything like what Kierkegaard suggested here. I want to go beyond that, though, and a bit of self-promotion, not entirely shameless, because I'm a bit ashamed to do it, but a bit of self-promotion in a book that I wrote called Unbinding Isaac. I do take this on a bit more explicitly and argue, I think pretty strongly, but I guess I would want your opinion on whether it was successful or not, that not only is Kierkegaard unprecedented, but he actually needs to be rejected. Like we shouldn't be passive when we read Kierkegaard. We need to like think about it and reject it very, very strongly. And three basic reasons why I think it needs to be rejected. So one, textually speaking, you'll notice that in the entire description of Kierkegaard, of the Akedah that I sort of drew from Kierkegaard, I never mentioned once that Isaac was actually not sacrificed. He's actually alive at the end of the story. That seems like a big deal, but Kierkegaard has nothing to say about that. In other words, for Kierkegaard, the entire interpretation of the story is all about the command to slaughter Isaac. It says nothing at all about the fact that God, in the end, actually issues a reprieve and allows Isaac to stay alive. So at least an interpreter has to at least deal with that. It seems like for Kierkegaard, that's sort of an afterthought. Like, accidentally, Isaac is alive for some sort of tangential or side reason. But that, in fact, it's all about the sacrifice. But one could at least argue that that's not the case. And in fact, the second half is the important part. And we will come back to that in a moment. Second point is that, again, in my entire summary of the Akedah a la Kierkegaard, I don't think I mentioned Isaac's name even once. It's all about Abraham for Kierkegaard. And that is, I think, incredibly dangerous. This I think gives rise to what some people have called Akedah theology. The sense, you actually can find this in a number of modern Jewish writings, I think unfortunately, but you find this in modern Jewish writings. Rhetoric that goes something like this. Look, I know that we all agree on certain shared values. I'll give you an example in a minute, but let's say we all agree on certain shared values. Unfortunately, though, in this particular case, I can't follow those values. I believe in those values, but I can't follow them because my faith requires me to set those values aside for a greater cause, for the sake of faith. What's scary about that is that typically, and I would say almost always, the person who's going to suffer because of my great sacrifice of setting aside my values is not me. It's not me, it's someone else. So essentially I'm saying, I am boldly and bravely setting aside my values, and therefore that person is going to suffer. So I'll give you a couple of examples, and these are unfortunately, I apologize if they hit home. These are drawn from real life, so they're contemporary issues. But I think the two big ones that I've come across, and I'm not going to quote anyone in particular right now, but people are on the record saying things of the sort. On the one hand, the question of LGBTQ plus people in traditional Jewish communities. So this is mostly in the Orthodox community, although there's some responsa from the conservative community that are also interestingly relevant, where the line goes something like, look, of course I believe in inclusiveness, I believe in taking everyone for who they are. I believe in understanding each person's nature and valuing each person, the Tzelem Elohim in each person. It's just, unfortunately, I have to set those values aside because of the non-negotiable value of the binding command of the Torah, which says that it is an abomination for a man to have same homosexual sex. And so what can I do? What can I do? I'm bound by this. And again, the key point that I want to make is not that that's wrong or right. It's certainly complicated. But the key point I want to make is that this person who's so racked by anxiety about putting aside their professed values is actually not the person who's going to suffer. It's the gay person who's going to suffer, for whom a place in the community has not been found. Very similar with gender, actually. And again, this is mostly in the traditional communities where the problem of gender has not been solved. And I've heard people say, of course, I believe in egalitarianism. I'm generally a liberal person, maybe even progressive person in modern society. But what can I do? What can I do? Now, who says this? Typically men, right? So men saying, like, what can I do? She can't be part. She'll have to suffer. So the key point is that this way of thinking, this way of saying, I set aside ethics for faith. And I want to make it clear, this is not what Kierkegaard's talking about exactly, because Kierkegaard's talking about personal faith, not scripture. But this way of thinking that I set aside ethics for faith does open up some ways of approaching contemporary issues. Again, this has been called Akedah theology, and it's dangerous. Again, that's not to say that it's always wrong. I'm not wading into that right now, but it is dangerous. It comes, someone else will pay the price for Abraham's faith. And now the third reason why I think Kierkegaard has to be rejected is that it's fundamentally a Christian idea. It's just not Jewish at all. What's so Christian about it? We don't have time to deal with this in a lot of detail, but to oversimplify, I think not unreasonably, Christianity from its very beginning has had much more of an emphasis on individuals' relationship with God, whereas Judaism has typically mediated that relationship through a community. Judaism is very communally oriented, and that means communally meaning prayer is communal, ideally, rather than personal. But it also means that people are communal. People are embedded in those relationships that tortured Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard said, "What am I going to be if I'm just relationships?" Judaism always said, "No, that's actually part of what it means to be a human being, is to have those relationships." Kierkegaard never married. Kierkegaard very famously broke off an engagement with a woman named Regina Olsen, and whether that's related to his thinking about the Akedah is an open question, but it certainly is parallel to his thinking about the Akedah. He said, I can't be tied down to this relationship. Then who will I be if I'm going to be a husband and a father and all these things? Then who will I be? How can I be authentic? And Judaism says, no, that's actually what it means to be a full person. Marriage is not only sociologically normal in Judaism, but is mandated in rabbinic texts that one must marry, one must procreate. This is actually seen as a religious obligation, whereas Jesus in the gospel says, the ideal person never gets married. There's only laws in the Bible about marriage for weak people who can't stay alone. But ideally, says Jesus, you stay alone with God, married to Christ, which is why the Christian tradition of monks and nuns was always the ideal religious figure, as opposed to the Jewish ideal religious figure, who was always married, always a family person. So this idea of the ideal, the high point of a person's spiritual life being when Abraham is alone on the mountaintop with God, even if we set aside the fact that he's not alone and Isaac's there, even if we set that aside, this idea that this is the ideal, that the best moment in one's life is to be alone with God, that's not a Jewish idea. I don't think it's a biblical idea, but we could, Jews and Christians could argue about that, but it's certainly not a Jewish idea. And so for these three reasons, textually speaking, Kierkegaard ignores the second half of the book. Ethically speaking, it's a dangerous door to open and walk through. And religiously speaking, Kierkegaard is fundamentally channeling Christian and specifically Protestant thought about religious ideals. I think as a Jew, you read this and you say, look, it's soaring prose, it's inspiring, and I need to reject it emphatically. What do we do though then? I mean, can we offer an alternative? So briefly, that's what I'm going to do now. Using a bit of archaeology and a bit of Maimonides, I'm going to offer an alternative. And this will be the final part here. So what's archaeology going to do for us? Well, archaeology is going to tell us that child sacrifice was actually horrifyingly practiced, in the ancient world. Not widespread. Sometimes people say, in Abraham's world, everyone was offering their children as sacrifices. That's not true at all. We have very limited evidence for child sacrifice, but we do have evidence for child sacrifice. It basically comes from the culture that we today call the Phoenicians, which were centered on the Mediterranean coast of northern Israel into Lebanon and even Syria. So from Haifa on north, basically, is the Phoenician heartland. But actually, all the evidence comes from Phoenician territories and settlements outside in the Mediterranean. Carthage is the primary source of data. And from Carthage, we have tens of thousands, I think it's 40,000 burials of children under a couple of years of age, burnt. The bones are singed in an urn in a clay pot, and a few hundred of these have inscriptions, which allows us to be absolutely sure of what's going on. And the inscriptions say things like, "This is the child of this mother and this father, offered as a sacrifice in fulfillment of a vow." It's sort of mind-boggling in a horrifying way to think about what that means, like how parents did this, what the process was, the emotions that must have been involved. It's actually something that I tried not to think about, although for working through the questions of the Akedah, you had to engage with it, have to engage with the material remains. We actually have these inscriptions, we have these graves, we have these burnt bones. It sort of it doesn't stop shocking, and yet again, I think it's important to say that these people did it out of piety. It's not that everyone in Carthage or all the Phoenicians were somehow pathological, homicidal maniacs. They're not at all. It's just a different set of values. You shift ethics in certain ways, and suddenly offering a child as a sacrifice makes some sense. And that sounds like a crazy thing to say. And I certainly don't want to be a spokesperson for child sacrifice. But let me try to articulate the logic anyway. So, of course, the Bible and Jewish thought takes animal sacrifice as quite central. Even in the modern age, when we don't have animal sacrifice, and many people don't want to return to animal sacrifice, I'll say that the idea of sacrifice is clearly central. Offering something. So very, very few people have a problem, and any sort of ethical problem, with offering the first fruits of the crop as a sacrifice to God, bringing the first few fruits and giving them to God, to the temple, to the priest, whatever it may be. Of course, it's bumped up a level if you're offering a sheep or a goat or even a cow. And then, even if we can wrap our heads around that, say, okay, but that's different from a kid, no? I mean, an actual child. Like, how does that work? But what does sacrifice do to begin with? How does sacrifice work? I mean, there's sort of the first level of understanding is that we're just offering thanks, right? Like, I got a good crop. I have these beautiful fruits growing in my orchard, so I should bring some to the priest. I should bring some to God. And I should say, thank you. You get these, and that seems fair. It's of course a cycle, right? Because it's both thanks for the past and hope for the future. So God provided for my crop this year, and I want God to provide for my crop next year. So I will acknowledge God. So God gave me, I give God, God gives me. And this, we have essentially a gift-giving cycle here, right? So God will give me something, I'll give God something, God will give me something, I'll give God something. And if all goes well, my hope is that this cycle simply continues. That's really what I want from this gift-giving cycle. Gift-giving cycles are part of life all the time, right? So a couple might, give each other gifts sporadically, spontaneously, ritualistically, certain key dates. Gift-giving cycle, right? It fosters the relationship, and it has to be reciprocated, right? Otherwise, neither side will find this to be fulfilling. So we do this all the time. If I invite you to a meal at my house, let's say you're coming for Friday night dinner, you might bring a bottle of wine or bring a jar of honey from your apiary in your yard. And why are you doing that? Well, because otherwise you would be totally in my debt, right? I would be providing you with a meal and you'd be providing nothing. And that's not comfortable. No one wants to have this imbalanced sort of relationship. We want to have a gift-giving cycle where I'll invite you, but you'll provide something. Maybe you'll say, oh, I couldn't bring anything, but I'm looking forward to having you back in my house. Great. We have a cycle, right? We have this reciprocity going on. And that's actually what builds relationships. Sometimes relationships have a problem of just not being balanced, right? What if one side of the relationship has much more time or money than the other side? And so it winds up being an imbalanced relationship. So one person keeps giving to the other person never is able to reciprocate. That's a problem. That is a problem. Now, the person might say, thank you very much. I'm really grateful. But at the end of the day, there's an imbalance in relationship. So some people call this the rich spouse syndrome, right? What happens if a man marries a woman with immense wealth? Let's assume she works for it. So he is free to sit at home, and she is sitting on huge amounts of money, and she can lavish him with all sorts of gifts. Now, he professes to love her, but can she be sure that he loves her? How does she know? I mean, after all, he might just be taking her, using her for the gifts. Right? There's an imbalance, and that imbalance produces real problems in the relationship. There's a problem that it's hard to overcome in such a case, because the whole point of the gift giving is that we show each other that we appreciate the relationship. We invest in this relationship. I give you something. I know you'll give me back. That's how you invest in the relationship. So when it's healthy, this builds the relationship. But what happens if it's imbalanced? How does she know that he really loves her and is not just using her for the money? And to some extent, that's an unsolvable problem, right? So if you happen to be immensely wealthy, then I feel bad for you, because you might never know whether people love you for you or for your money. It's a real problem. As Tevi would say, I hope I have this problem one day. But God has this problem. And that's the point that I think is really crucial here. God has the wealthy spouse problem. So sure, the farmer brings the first fruits and says, oh God, thank you so much for giving me a good harvest of figs. I really appreciate it. Here are some figs to your priest. But there's an imbalance here. God provides everything, and you've given a basket of figs. So you can bump it up a level. You can offer a sheep or a cow and say, God, thank you so much for the flocks that I have. Here's a sheep back. And that's more of a gift. But no sheep in the world are ever going to come close to what God has provided you with. And so God has a problem. How do you ever know? How does God ever know that anyone really cares about God? Like, how can he ever overcome? How could God ever overcome the wealthy spouse problem? And at the end of the day, there is a terrible imbalance in the relationship between anyone and God. And God can therefore never be sure that anyone really cares about God and is not just using God because God will provide sheep and fruits. How do you know? All the sheep in the world can't do it. But you know what could? A child can. Because unlike sheep, children are not replaceable. Right? That's the basic issue with sheep. Sure, I give you a sheep, but you know what? I have 100 more. And if all goes well, because I gave you one, I'll get 10 more. And I don't really care about that particular sheep. Like, who cares? Replacing one sheep with a different sheep, just as good. But that's not true with children. I think that seems intuitively true. So I don't need to justify that. I think it's obvious that that's just not true with children. Offering a child is in fact offering something that God cannot replace. Sure, I can have another child, but that's not the same as replacing a child. This is a gift that cannot be reciprocated. And so it solves the problem of the wealthy spouse being God. Here's a way that I can give God something that is clearly pure. It's really because I believe in my relationship with God. I want to invest in that relationship. It's not because I'm expecting anything back. That's because nothing can replace that child. So that's a justification for child sacrifice. But of course, if we're going to think about the Akedah, I think we need to explain something like that for the first half of the story, but then we have to explain the second half of the story. And here's where Maimonides comes in. Maimonides, I'm not going to try to sort of interpret the text right now. You have it in front of you, but Maimonides seems to make it clear that that the crux of the story is really the second half. And I'll sort of skip to this slide, where Maimonides in the Guide to the Perplexed talks about the levels of prophecies. And all prophecies are arranged in levels. The highest level, you see at the bottom of the slide here, the 11th level, that he sees an angel speaking to him, like Abraham at the time of the Akedah. This is, in my view, the highest level of prophets that the books testify about their states. So the end of the Akedah, right? When did an angel come? The end of the Akedah, the second revelation of the Akedah, is the highest level of prophecy. What about the first one? Well, the first one is a seventh level prophecy, says Maimonides. The seventh level that he sees in a prophetic dream as if he, may he be exalted, speaks to him. So what Maimonides says is that the first part of the Akedah, the command to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, that was a seventh level prophecy. The command to not offer Isaac as a sacrifice, that was an 11th level prophecy. And I think Maimonides is trying to solve a problem that we talked about last class. Last class, we talked about the problem. We were talking about Saadia Gaon, who had the problem, how could God change God's mind? How does that make any sense? Maimonides solves the problem in the following amazingly profound way. God didn't change God's mind at all. Abraham understood God better and better over the course of the Akedah. So if we sort of froze the story halfway through, Abraham would have given us an account of child sacrifice, much like the one I just gave on behalf of the Carthaginians. He would have explained that child sacrifice is absolutely necessary because there's nothing as sublime as a gift to God of something that's irreplaceable. And in his case, it would have been literally irreplaceable. This child was a miracle child, born when he was 100 years old. There's no way he's having another child. And so there was nothing that he could do for God that would have been as profound as offering Isaac as a sacrifice. And Abraham, if we had paused the story, Abraham would have said that story exactly. But at the end of the story, the second half of the story, he understands God even better. He understands God better. He understands that actually, despite all of that logic that we just tried to articulate, all that's true, and yet God doesn't want it. So it's all true. In other words, it's not that that's wrong. That is true. That makes a lot of sense. Good. God gets it also. And yet God doesn't want it. Why would that be true and yet God doesn't want it? Straightforward. There's a conflict of values here. On the one hand, all of that's true. This is a great value. Offering God a sacrifice that is irreplaceable is absolutely a value. But there's a greater value. And the greater value is the value of Isaac's life. Because here's something that we've glossed over when we just articulated the logic of child sacrifice. We talked about children as if they were sheep. I have sheep, I have children. But I have sheep, I have children makes it sound like my relationship to the sheep is the same as my relationship to the children. And that, I think, is where the second part of the story says, that's not true. The sheep are yours. The sheep don't have independent value. There's no ontological value of the sheep's life. Now, we could debate this, but this is, I think, the crux of the biblical thought about animals. They don't have value in and of themselves. They are literally yours. You control them. Do with them what you'd like. Sacrifice them? Fantastic. But when you say, I have children, that's a whole different sentence. It doesn't mean I own the children, I control the children. There are schools of thought, there were in the ancient world, there are in the modern world, that literally my child is mine. I remember seeing a sitcom when I was a kid where a father says, I brought you into this world and I can take you out of this world. And that's one vision of what it means to have a child, right? I have a child like I have a sheep. It's my sheep, my child. I'll do with it what I want. But that's not the biblical view at all. The biblical view is that, sure, Abraham has Isaac, but once Isaac exists, Isaac's own person. Isaac is not just merely Abraham's child. And once you say that, child sacrifice falls apart. You can't do it. I don't care how profound you think it is as an experience. You can't do it, right? It would be like me arguing that me sacrificing you would be a profound experience. Sure, maybe it would be. I don't know. But even if it is, I can't do it. That's just murder. I can't kill you for my religious experience. And that, I think, is the crux of what Maimonides is trying to do. He's trying to say the end of the story is where Abraham understands God even better than he did at the beginning of the story. At first, he understood child sacrifice, and then he understands the rejection of child sacrifice. And a bit of confirmation for this comes from a slightly later philosophy named Joseph Ibn Kaspi, who lived in late 13th, early 14th century Provence. And he makes a point that we really haven't talked about, but this is the last textual point we'll get to make here. He points out that the names of God change in the story. At the beginning of the story, we had Elohim nisat Abraham. God, Elohim, tested Abraham. But when the angel shows up, it's not Malach Elohim, it's Malach Hashem, using the four-letter name of God, who commands Abraham to not sacrifice Isaac. And Ibn Kasbi says, I'll tell you how these names work. When a character understands God from afar, the name Elohim is used. He understands God as an abstraction. But when he understands God intimately, when he really gets God, then the tetragrammaton, the four-letter name Hashem, Adonai, is used. And that's why at the beginning, God was understood by Abraham only as an abstraction, as a set of ideas. And so he thought he should offer Isaac to him as an abstraction. This makes sense philosophically. But then Malach Adonai shows up, Malach Hashem shows up, the angel of the Lord shows up. And now Abraham understands God more intimately, more profoundly, more personally, and understands that God, fully understood, absolutely rejects child sacrifice. This is actually a theme later in the Bible, that God rejects child sacrifice, but understands that you think that God wants it. So Jeremiah says, you think that I want it. You've built the high places in Tophet and the valley of Ben Hinnom to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, something I never commanded, nor did it enter my mind. But that rejection is sort of clearly implies that Jeremiah is talking to people who think that God did command it. God wants this. No, it's not true. It makes sense that God would want it, but that's a partial understanding of God. A fuller understanding of God understands that God rejects it. I'm going to close with just one last insight, and this takes us in a bit of a different direction from Elie Wiesel. And Elie Wiesel says that actually something that we haven't goes in a direction we haven't discussed until this point, but I think tallies nicely with what we were just discussing. Wiesel, in an essay that's in this book, Messengers of God, and on YouTube, you can actually find a video of him giving this as a lecture in Manhattan. He develops the claim that actually this is not just us working through this post facto. Actually, Abraham got this all from the beginning. Abraham knew that God could not allow child sacrifice. Of course, Abraham knew that. Abraham understood God. Abraham understood that this God that whom he had talked to about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom and Amorah, Abraham understood that God believed in justice and righteousness, and certainly understood that God would not allow an innocent child to be sacrificed. So he understood this was a test. And he could have called God's bluff at the beginning. God says, Abraham, I want you to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. Abraham could have said, come on, God, no, you don't. I know you. You don't really want that. But instead, Abraham says, okay, I see what you're doing. You're testing me. I'm going to test you. And he plays essentially a very high stakes game of chicken with God. He says, let's see how long you let this go. I know you can't let this go because just last chapter you said Isaac will be your heir. We have a covenant. We have a deal. You've promised me over and over. So I know you can't let me sacrifice Isaac, but I won't say it. I'm just going to pretend that I'm going to go through with it. And I'm going to force you, God, to call it off. I don't want to be the one to call it off. I want to force you to call it off. And so he walks with Isaac up the mountain, and he takes this string with him, and he binds Isaac to the altar, and he sets up the wood, and he lights the fire, and he takes out the knife, and he's ready to sacrifice, and he's waiting for God to call it off. And just at the last second, God finally does. And Abraham's blood pressure must have been through the roof, but finally God calls it off, as Abraham knew God had to. Why? What's the benefit of all this? It's just a game. You just want to see if you can get God to fold. He says, no. God subjected Abraham to it. At the same time, Abraham forced it on God, as though Abraham had said, I defy you, Lord. I shall submit to your will. Let's see whether you go through to the end, whether you remain passive and remain silent when the life of my son, also your son, is at stake. And God changed his mind and relented. Abraham won. Now, again, what's the point of this all? The point is that at the very end of the story, God says, I now swear by myself that you will have a nation of offspring. Your offspring will be multiplied, they will be successful. I swear by myself, bi nishbati. Everyone swears by God. God swears by God's self. And that is an expression we've never seen before in the Bible. And nowhere in the Torah has God ever taken an oath before. And Abraham pushed God to the edge to force God to take an oath. At this point, Abraham sort of holds God over the altar and says, look, I won. I won. You lost. You bet that you could make me fold, and you lost. I won. And God says, so what do you want from me? So I'll tell you what I want. I want an ironclad oath by your own name that you swear that my offspring will be successful, will survive, will go on in this world. And God says, Bi nishbati, I swear by myself. So Abraham extracts from God even more of a promise, a stronger promise, a grander promise than he had ever gotten until now. And I think this is Wiesel's great insight, is to turn the story around and say it's not just that Elohim nisat Abraham, that God was testing Abraham. Actually, in the end, it's Abraham who tested God, and Abraham won. And Abraham won for our sake. The Midrash says that God said to Abraham, okay, so what do you want? And Abraham said, I just want you to remember this moment, because there will come a time when my descendants will not deserve your goodness, your help, your attention. There will come a time. I know that. But at that time, I want you, God, to remember this day. I want you to remember what I did here on the mountaintop. And I want you to then say, even if you don't deserve it, your ancestor Abraham deserves it. And for Abraham's sake, I will stand with you. And it's for that reason, as Wiesel in the Midrash, that the covenant, the oath that God took on that day, stands all the way to the present time. So I look forward to seeing you in person for our last class. I pray that this covenant remains and that the nation of Israel remains a nation of strength and especially peace. And I hope that we meet in a time of peace.